have worked or are likely to work?
In my opinion, the threats are next to useless. In fact, the threat of war crimes prosecution is counterproductive, since Putin therefore has no way back. And as for sanctions, the sad fact is that Russia is carrying on its offensive. Quite the contrary should be done now. NATO should be discussing how to intervene militarily. I point out that in the book many years ago I wrote, I foresaw the West to do nothing, or next to nothing to be more accurate. And then when Ukraine fell, what will it do then? The Baltic states are in easy capture, and then the war would shift therefore to someone like Poland, whereupon it might go theatre local nuclear. In this case, what is quite clear, we can stop the war here in Ukraine, but words, sanctions, threats of prosecutions are a step from hot air.
Unfortunately, it's words that we've got at the moment, with some action, backed up by a bit of action. A lot of diplomatic conversations, for instance, taking place today, as you mentioned, NATO, the EU, the G7, and closer to home, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson meeting the Polish President and the German Chancellor. The ostensible aim is, I suppose, to put forward a united front over the war in Ukraine. But does it also lay bare the divisions?
Unfortunately, the latter is the case. Germany has a different view and has held a different view for many years. It has actually very good business relations with Russia, and Russian cheap energy has been one of the mainstays of the German economy. Poland is almost the exact opposite. For many centuries now, it has been fighting with Russia, and therefore it sees a totally different objectives, totally different views. Such a conference is more likely, in fact, to play into Putin's hands, in the sense that it gets nowhere, it's more words, whilst at the same time, if there were to be, and we're on the verge of a quarrel between Poland and Germany, then that would be very bad indeed.
You don't seem to be very impressed with sanctions. I mean, there's been some concern raised in the US and parts of Europe that the sanctions may become too effective, and that painful sanctions may actually induce the Russians to become more aggressive, not just towards Ukraine, but also towards the West. And of course, Poland in the firing line there. What do you think of that?
That's a very interesting argument, whether sanctions can be too effective. Rather, I would put it as a package of statements put out by the West and actions which are overtly anti-Russian, and therefore, taken as a whole, Russia may well indeed react. But rather, I believe that Russia is in any case geared or committed to moving forwards. So in that sense, excessive sanctions will be no different to anything else stated, in the sense that the Russians will go ahead anyway, unless they're stopped militarily.
And you talked earlier about these, meetings laying bare the divisions. Ukraine accusing Hungary of helping Vladimir Putin in its invasion and its aftermath. Budapest has announced it's happy to pay for Russian imports in rubles. It opposes calls for an embargo on oil and gas. It refuses requests to supply Ukraine with weapons. I mean, how far is European and NATO unity undermined by Hungary?
Oh, very much so. The problem with Europe is it's 27 nations, and one nation, if it steps out of line, does give a very strong impression of disunity. But I would argue that on top of Hungary, we also have to point out that China and India and other countries might well also want to carry on trading with Russia. And personally, I would imagine that Germany, given the opportunity, and France may well also prefer to trade rather than to take serious moves which will damage their own economies.